This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com. Virginia hospitals and health systems provide jobs. They support our economy and promote public health. Local hospitals are always open to help people with unexpected health needs. Having a stable healthcare network is vital. Virginia hospitals are our lifeline.
It's amazing what my students with special needs can accomplish. Their pride is priceless. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a welcome to a duo that we've had on before several times over the years when both of you were members of the House. But today we welcome Senator Jennifer McClellan, Delegate Chris Peace. Thank you for being on. We're having a conversation just as the legislative session is wrapping up. Folks are now seeing it in this time between now and reconvene day in April, and we're really interested in having you tell us about issues that passed or maybe that didn't and will be coming back, or issues that you think that could be before the reconvene session. So we'll start with the senator first.
Yes.
Okay.
Chris?
Well, obviously the biggest piece of legislation we dealt with was the budget, and I think having to close the budget shortfall, but both the House and the Senate had priorities of providing raises for our for public employees, teachers, state police, Capitol Police, and also making sure we held K-12 harmless and making sure that we provided necessary investments in the mental health system. I think the one area where most would agree we didn't go far enough was mental health. We went as far as we could given the current budget shortfall, but I think if the next budget cycle is a little bit better, we've still got a little more work to do on that front.
We've obviously seen the economy improving year over year. That's a good sign for the things that Jennifer is talking about in terms of future investments in mental health. I know there's been some concern about how we're addressing investigations in local jails,
Right.
how we're supporting our local community services boards, and for example, like Henrico Mental Health, which it does a lot of work in our region, or the Hanover CSB. We did take some very positive steps this session in terms of recognizing the importance of access for the greater population when there's a crisis, to support efforts that really were led by Chesterfield's CSB to create same-day access, where you would get a screening and referral for services. People had been waiting way too long to try to access services. We also in the House expanded the GAP program, which provides a lot of mental health and substance use support services for our less fortunate adult population that can't otherwise access health care. I think generally speaking, as Jennifer mentioned, the priorities started with the House budget, Senate budgets, to address pay, to deal with the compression problems that we're seeing when people are coming in at a starting salary that's at or near what someone who's been working there for many years is making, particularly our state police. We also worked on local law enforcement as well and Capitol Police, but moving that needle on the starting salary for state police from about $36,000 a year to over $43,000 per year, I think makes a great deal of difference. We've had a tough, couple of years nationally when it comes to law enforcement and justice, and to remember the principles of community policing and community engagement. Not many people want to sign up to be in law enforcement right now, and that's a real problem for our society. So we need to recognize these individuals, especially state employees as well, that we don't want to see the type of attrition and the vacancies that we may see as people age in our state workforce and we don't have anyone to replace them. So we're trying to be good stewards of the tax dollars and make important investments in our number one capital, which is human capital. It's our people that matter the most.
I will remind our viewers that you're somewhat handicapped in not knowing what the final decision will be between the budget conferees, whether it's on the pay issue or others, and so there some differences between the two chambers, so those will be worked out by the time our viewers are seeing it, and then it will be in the governor's hands to see what he chooses to send back to you.
That's right.
So what else, Senator McClellan?
Well, this year was an election year in the House, so not surprisingly, there were a number of controversial bills that were voted a straight party line vote. Things we've seen before, things the governor has vetoed before, everything from, well, I don't know if the governor's had this one yet. There were a lot of sort of anti-sanctuary city bills, bills dealing with immigration and how far our state and local officials will go to enforce federal immigration law. There's always a bill to defund Planned Parenthood in some way. There are always disputes over guns, and I think the one really interesting disagreement we've had over the past couple of years is what to do with victims of domestic violence who may feel threatened. There was a bill last year and this year to say that you could get a concealed carry permit for 45 days without having to go through the normal process, which would include training. Folks on my side were a little uncomfortable with that because when you insert a gun into a already very volatile situation without training, sometimes bad things happen. There was another bill that would say once someone gets a protective order, the court will provide information on where to get gun safety training, which on my side we felt there you're sort of setting up that the most important service a domestic violence victim needs is a gun safety program. We amended that on the Senate side to now say you will also provide other information about services that they may need, whether it's housing, lawyer, medical services. So we'll see if the House accepts that and what the governor does. But not surprisingly, we do get a few controversial bills. But for the most part, most of what we dealt with was not partisan. It either fell out on regional lines, urban, suburban, rural. Or a lot of things that we did, we passed unanimously. So, but being an election year, you always get that maybe 5 to 10% of partisan politics.
Jennifer and I have had the opportunity to work on the domestic violence issues over the years, and Jennifer served on the Courts of Justice Committee in the House for a long time, and as a lawyer brings a lot of experience to that. And I'm on the Appropriations Budget Committee. And together we were able to work on certain policy initiatives as well as trying to find additional funding. And at one point, a few years ago, we had about $18 million shortfall or gap in funding, and shelters were being closed, call centers were not being manned, court accompaniment was not happening for victims of domestic violence. And we took a real lead in that effort and got a lot of new money in the budget for those purposes. And this year, I know the Senate budget did not include it, but very optimistic that the conference report will include another $1.5 million for sexual assault and domestic violence victims that will be matched 4 to 1 by the federal funds through the Victim of Crimes Act, through DCJS. And those monies will continue the progress that Jennifer and I and others have made in that regard to make sure we don't see a Danville close again, or that we can keep open the center that's new on the Eastern Shore. These crimes are silent crimes most of the time in our community, rural and suburban communities. People don't talk about it. Another area that I find is very similar in that regard is adult financial exploitation. We both care about that. We've got an aging citizenry. I put in a bill last year that asked DARS, the Aging and Rehab Services Department, to conduct a study similar to one that was done in Utah. And they found that there's tremendous negative financial impact to the entire state, not just to individuals, from adult financial exploitation. And they made several recommendations on how to expand the number of financial institutions that are covered when Adult Protective Services does investigations, what they can look at, as well as expand the definition of what an adult is and what exploitation may be. I'm hopeful that that's a small step in the right direction to make sure that our seniors who are aging, I know we'll be there someday, I hope, that they're not being taken advantage of, in many cases by loved ones, and no one knows about it. And that's an area that I think we need to focus on, as well as child welfare and so many other important issues that all of our families care about.
Another area we have been grappling with that I think we'll see a lot more work on is sort of dealing with the new economy, the new gig economy. Last year we had bills dealing with Airbnb that went to the Housing Commission. This year we had a bill, a pretty narrow bill that just allows localities to pass an ordinance to require anyone who does rent their property to register. Because at a minimum, we're finding that a lot of people who do rent their houses for short-term periods of time aren't paying taxes that go along with that income. And so at a minimum, this gives those localities the ability to do that. I had a bill, we've spent a lot of time the last couple of years dealing with TNCs like Uber and Lyft. I had a bill that now recognizes a new type of business, a broker for Uber or Lyft, that would allow you to make reservations with that company for a driver, but our laws didn't recognize that or allow it, so now we passed the legal framework for that. Dealing with property carriers, now that Uber and Lyft are branching out and not just driving people, but driving property, how to deal with that. And then we had an interesting bill I call the robot cooler bill, where now using robots to deliver property and what should be the legal framework for that. I think we've started now just trying to make sure we have a legal framework in place that protects consumers and business interests. But I think going forward, we're going to really grapple with what happens with these employees and the social contract that we've had. Most people get insurance through their employer and benefits, and will that translate into this new sharing economy? That's something I know on the federal level they're grappling with. But there are types of businesses that 2, 3, 5 years ago we never could have imagined that now we're having to make sure our laws catch up to this new economy and not stifle it.
Just ask bank tellers when the ATMs came about.
Right.
It's I know I think it was a labor secretary nominee was in the news when there were statements that he had made. I think he was the head of Carl Jr.'s at Hardee's, and saying that it's a lot easier when you have a robot as an employee. There's no slip and fall. There's no sexual harassment claim. There's no there are a lot of things that never get an order wrong. Those kinds of things. But I think it fails to recognize what Jennifer pointed out is that we have human beings, people who have a responsibility to their families that may get put out of work based on some of this innovation. Where's the balance? I think asking that question, can Virginia be a digital dominion again, as Governor Gilmore named us so aptly maybe 20 years ago, and can we get in the vanguard of trying to establish templates for all of these different technologies within our state code? I think Uber and Lyft was a little bit easier to deal with a couple years ago, because you're only dealing really with insurance, and you're dealing with the DMV that licensed drivers and provides for the safety of our motoring public. With Airbnb, it was a lot more challenging because you're dealing with over 100 localities that care very much about their land use and what types of activities can be conducted in certain areas of their jurisdiction. And then you have rural and suburban and urban differences of opinion about that. And I think we know that when there's a big bike race in the city of Richmond, the Airbnb usage would go up. It's not necessarily happening in Hanover, New Kent, or King William in our district. I had some disagreements with some other of our colleagues about how to achieve that goal. I think the bill that may pass this year is probably a positive first step, but doesn't do a whole lot in terms of changing what existing law is. I think we still need a central point of tax collection for that. The Housing Commission recommended a statewide policy And I'm hopeful we can avoid the Madras effect of having, you know, over 100 different laws dealing with that. It doesn't make Virginia very open for business. There was another bill Delegate Farrell had, I'm not sure of its progress, but it was trying to address these lending apps and whether these are banks for purposes of state regulation. You know, because you can go on an app and lend someone money around the world, $10,000, and there's no credit check, or there's, you know, very little consumer protection that's involved. And at the same time, there are people who may never qualify for a loan that maybe would benefit from having access to these platforms. And, you know, it's a catch-22. I know we've both cared about regulating the car title lending and the payday lending over the years, which tends to may exploit certain folks in our community, certainly very high interest rates of return, and, you know, concern that a lending app like that would do the same, but balancing against the fact that there are people who may not have access to cash and to services that they may well need. So it's always that balance. Where can you find that in public policy?
Now, committees, you've stayed with your committees, and appropriations a key one,
Right.
vice chair on general laws, and keys there, as well as HWI that you're on. You've swapped some committees,
All
or
new, yes.
all new areas that you're working in, and are there issues that you're still working on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you're one of 40 instead of one of 100, you sort of get involved in things whether you're on a committee or not. And so, you know, I was on the education committee my entire time in the House. It's been a #1 priority for me. I'm still focused on those bills, either, you know, bills that I've sponsored or bills that I've co-patroned. Still heavily involved in bills dealing with the school to prison pipeline. There were 2 sets of bills dealing with long-term suspension and expulsion, which disproportionately impacts students of color and students with disabilities. House and Senate versions are very, very different, so yet to be seen what comes out of that, but that's still a conversation I'm part of. I had a couple of other education bills this year, one adding, last year we added to the family life education curriculum information on how to avoid sexual assault and domestic violence. I sort of took that to the next step to say that you have to also teach that consent is required for sexual activity. Also focus on the importance of family relationships other than just marriage, because, you know, family is broader than just husband and wife. And then worked with Delegate Greason to deal with how to create capacity to train teachers for computer science. Last year we passed legislation to sort of make computer science a core competency in K-12, and yet we haven't put a structure in place to train the teachers, and so we had legislation this year to do that. So even though I'm on transportation, local government, and agriculture, natural resources, and conservation, still very heavily involved in education issues, and probably will be for a long time.
Yes. I think Richmond can be very proud of the Code RVA project regarding computer technology, and I think it can help the whole region. I'm glad Jennifer mentioned the school to prison pipeline. I was chairman of the Commission on Youth for about 6 years and took a look at those issues. The bills that are currently pending regarding long-term suspension have had interesting debate. I'm not sure if the debate has always been about what the bill says,
right.
As to what people think it says,
right.
Because there are provisions, at least in the House version, that would allow flexibility for the local school district to continue to extend the suspensions up to 364 days, which was the current law. Serving as a guardian ad litem and working in family law and in the juvenile courts, you can see how difficult it is for certain school districts to handle children who have significant disabilities who may be on a trend or trajectory towards a residential program to support their emotional needs, their emotional health and behavioral health needs. But the law calls for the school to seek out and find all of the lesser restrictive alternatives so that that child can remain in school and the Constitution can be honored where it says a child must have a free and public education. So it's this, again, I go back to balance. How does the school district balance those needs, provide a solid education, honor the child and family, and do its job, but also maintain a safe environment and provide the proper structure that is so often needed. You know, a lot of people in the community don't want that child who's a real menace potentially to be out, you know, for a whole year, roaming the neighborhoods or getting into more trouble. You know, so having the SROs properly trained in the schools, the teachers aware of the situation, the funding available for the residential programs plus the educational component, all of this is so important. We actually had language in the House budget to look at also the prevalence and increase in ADHD medications. There's a lot of concern out there that we're way over medicating our children. So we're trying to look at all of these issues in a comprehensive way and sort of first do no harm. That's the Hippocratic Oath of governing.
The school funding, just to ask you to touch on that, whether it's City of Richmond or whether it's part of your jurisdictions or whether it's South Side, Southwest, and other areas. Stories come up about the inequities every session, and yet the difficulty in trying to readjust any formula. As you look on beyond this session and on toward 2018 and beyond, are you of the perspective there needs to be some reorientation? Are you satisfied with what's there now as far as the state funding?
Well, there's never enough money, right? You know, and I think that's the bottom line. How much can you do with what you've got? And the House position this year, we'll see what happens in the budget conference, adopted a new strategy called 10-10-10. It's not, not very original concept, but it looks at dealing with the localities that have seen a decline in headcount and population over the last 10 years and who are under 10,000 students enrolled. And so that is going to be your South Side, Southwest, or rural localities primarily, and they're going to see an extra support from a funding perspective to hold them harmless, essentially, because that headcount drives that index that leads to the state funding for the locality. We're also trying to increase the flexibility with the monies that are sent down to local governments with the lottery. That was not designed to be a supplanting device. That was designed to be money on top, icing on the cake. And so I think we're trying gradually to get back to that original concept of that the lottery is extra money for schools, that they can have flexibility with how they use it. And hopefully that will provide a bit of support. In the House budget, I know that Hanover received a little bit more money for public education as well as New King William. Is it enough? I think you'll know the answer when you talk to some of the local governments.
What's frustrating is what we need to do, we don't have the political will to do, and that is to just start over with the local composite index formula. And I've put in and others have put in legislation probably for the past 10 years to study how we fund education, look at what other states do, see if we can do it better. Because the problem with the formula, it calculates each locality's ability to pay based on indicators of wealth 40 years ago. It doesn't look at what else does that government have to pay for. So here in the city of Richmond, we have 100-year-old infrastructure that in some places is crumbling. It doesn't account for that. We've got one of the highest concentrations of poverty and associated needs with that in the school system and out. It doesn't account for that. It doesn't account for areas like Goochland that are very land rich, but so their ability to pay is skewed by some very, very, very high priced properties. And yet, the problem with any formula is no one is willing to open it up because you create winners and losers. And so today's winners are afraid they'll be tomorrow's losers.
And for our areas, you know, Northern Virginia is the cash cow, if you will. I mean, they probably send more dollars to Richmond than they get back, and we're all benefited by that. So you open it up, and then you put your own jurisdictions at risk if you're not in Northern Virginia, and that's a scary proposition for a lot of people who serve. You know, Jennifer also has the additional issues here in the city of it being a seat of state government. How much space is occupied by state government that is not paying taxes to the city, and the size of the city without with the moratorium on annexation. With other issues with the inability to grow and expand, there's only but so much elbow room in the city to see economic development. I think that's a challenge that the new mayor, LeVar Stoney, faces, and we look forward to partnering with him as a region to address those issues. Intractable pockets of poverty, both in the city and rural communities, are also issues. We're trying to work with the mayor on community wealth building as well.
And I'm getting the signal that we're going to leave it there, but that's a good place we'll start another conversation in the future. But thank you both very much for being on This Week in Richmond.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community. For jobs, the economy, and public health, Virginia Hospitals, our lifeline.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.